Robby, what's on your radar?
Well, toward the end of Tuesday night's vice presidential debate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz argued with Senator J.D. Vance about former President Donald Trump's efforts to remain in power following his 2020 election loss. Trump's conduct was indefensible, and thus Vance did not do a very good job defending it. Rather, he attempted to turn the tables on Walz, accusing the Democratic ticket of disrespecting the most important democratic norm of all, free speech. He said, quote, "You guys attack us for not believing in democracy. The most sacred right under United States democracy is the First Amendment." Now, Vance went on to accuse Walz of wanting to criminalize misinformation, referencing previous inaccurate comments the governor made about exceptions to the First Amendment. At that point, Walz actually interrupted Vance and claimed that the First Amendment does not protect misinformation or threatening or hate speech.
It's a damning non-answer for you to not talk about censorship. Obviously, Donald Trump and I think that there were problems in 2020. We've talked about it. I'm happy to talk about it further. But you guys attack us for not believing in democracy. The most sacred right under the United States democracy is the First Amendment. You yourself have said there's no First Amendment right to misinformation. Kamala Harris wants to use the power of government and big tech to silence people from speaking their minds. That is a threat to democracy that will long outlive this present political moment. I would like Democrats and Republicans to both reject censorship. Let's persuade one another. Let's argue about ideas, and then let's come together afterwards.
You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That's the test. That's the Supreme Court test.
Tim, fire in a crowded theater. You guys wanted to kick people off of Facebook for saying that toddlers shouldn't wear masks.
Senator, the governor does have the floor.
Fire in a crowded theater. That is criticizing the policies of the government, which is the right of every American.
Senator, the governor does have the floor for 1 minute to respond to you.
Yeah, well, I don't run Facebook.
So in other words, according to Walz, misinformation, threats, and hate speech are all unprotected categories of speech. Now, the governor is mostly very wrong there. He is correct to note that true threats of violence lack First Amendment protection if they are specific enough. Misinformation and hate speech, however, are absolutely protected by the First Amendment. While the former is a relatively new category of expression facing explicit calls for censorship, misinformation, the latter category, hate speech, has been exhaustively litigated before the Supreme Court. Now, pay attention to what Walz said there. He had defended his position by glibly asserting that it is constitutionally impermissible to yell fire in a crowded theater. He said that's the Supreme Court standard. And it's an often expressed sentiment. We hear it all the time. It's also completely and utterly false. Let me say that again. It is false to say that that is the standard. It comes from a Supreme Court opinion, an odious opinion, in the 1919 case Schenck versus the United States, in which the majority held, in that case, the government could stop people from distributing leaflets opposing World War I. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes likened such activism as akin to yelling fire in a crowded theater. In other words, he believed that raising doubts about the desirability of U.S. participation in such a global catastrophe was dangerous and could be prohibited by government. Today, we recognize that right to criticize U.S. military policy and oppose foreign wars is obviously an essential component of the First Amendment. And today, the Supreme Court agrees, because Schenck was gradually overturned by subsequent First Amendment-related decisions. The right to engage in speech that the government might deem reckless, dangerous, or hateful was explicitly affirmed in the recent case in 2017, Mittal versus Tam, in which Justice Samuel Alito observed, quote, "The proudest boast of our free speech jurisprudence is that we protect the freedom to express the thought that we hate." In other words, hate speech. Could not be more simple than that. Hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. People should stop saying otherwise. Now, it shouldn't be surprising. After all, if hate speech constituted unprotected speech, it would create all sorts of problems. I mean, what counts as hateful speech? It's purely subjective. Religious people, for instance, might find blasphemy to be hateful, but it's sufficiently obvious that the federal government cannot criminalize criticism of religion. Similarly, political figures might determine that their opponents running attack ads against them are examples of hateful messaging. Sometimes those messages are hateful. But if censorship was allowed on this basis, there would be no end in sight. It just doesn't make sense. Now, it's incredibly common to hear otherwise. Informed persons try to draw some distinction between hate speech and free speech. They are misinformed. From the standpoint of the First Amendment, there is no recognized difference. End of story. Hate speech is free speech. Misinformation is no different. The Supreme Court has not specifically taken up the question, but it should be sufficiently obvious that people can disagree on what is true and what is false. The Enlightenment principle that undergirds the First Amendment and democracy itself is that the best way to counter bad information is to allow everyone to speak. Investing some central government authority with the power to determine what is true can backfire horribly, since the government is frequently wrong. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic provides a powerful illustration of why criminalizing misinformation is a fraught project. Time and time again, the expert consensus among government bureaucrats was proved to be flawed, incomplete, or flat out wrong. People need the right to disagree with one another and with their government. Thankfully, Americans do enjoy that protection under the First Amendment. There is no misinformation exception. I can't say it enough times. Now, it's true that many progressive elites wish they had the power to censor misinformation. Take, for instance, former Secretary of State John Kerry, who recently lamented that the First Amendment was a, quote, major block to tackling this problem. Let's watch.
If people go to only one source, and the source they go to is sick and, has an agenda, and they're putting out disinformation, our First Amendment stands as a major block to the ability to be able to just, hammer it out of existence. So what we need is to win the ground, win the right to govern by hopefully having, winning enough votes that you're free to be able to implement change.
The tone of Kerry's remarks there suggests that he is not altogether thrilled about this situation. Winning the right to govern? Does he mean winning the right to limit the First Amendment? But as he begrudgingly acknowledges, the U.S. is different from every country on earth in that its laws significantly constrain the federal government's speech-related policy making. Walz, however, doesn't seem to recognize this fact. That's very worrying. After all, the Biden administration went to great lengths to test the boundaries of the First Amendment and pressure social media companies to engage in suppression of disfavored speech. That was the thrust of Vance's criticisms. He accused Democrats of counteracting democracy for explicitly supporting censorship on social media. Walz could have neutralized this line of attack by affirming that the federal government cannot and should not work to forcibly remove misinformation and hate speech from internet platforms, but he declined to do so. Worse than that, he clearly considers, Tim Walz does, misinformation to be a form of expression that is beyond the realm of First Amendment protection, but it is not. So I was suitably troubled by what Tim Walz had to say there. Again, these are common misconceptions about the First Amendment. Yes, true threats of violence are not protected. Libel and slander are not protected, but these are very, very narrow categories. You can still make provocative and sometimes violent messaging, and that is protected. What is absolutely protected is hate speech, because there's no category of speech that's hate speech. There's no stone tablets where they say this is hate speech and everything hateful is written down. Supreme Court has not said that. In fact, all recent decisions go against the idea that hate speech could be criminalized, and misinformation is the same way.
So fighting words, which is an exception,
yes,
and that can be interpreted many ways. Now, I'm not saying that there's a lot of things that are not protected under free speech that are very hard to try, and that's why they're rarely tried. Like if you're a public persona and you have been defamed, it's almost, it's not gonna happen. You're not gonna go there. Very rarely do people move forward and fight, take out, it's a lot.
I would say it's rightly difficult because we want the bar for that to be pretty high. I mean, other countries that don't have the First Amendment, they have libel and defamation cases all the time where it's hard to even criticize a public figure, even if you're right. I mean, this impacts journalists elsewhere.
The UK has this issue.
The UK has this problem.
Famously.
Australia has this problem. During their Me Too moments, they couldn't say anything about people because they could get sued out of existence.
Yeah, that's right. I work for a UK publication, The Spectator, and so unfortunately I've become familiar with the UK laws on this, not because we're out there, running around publishing false reports, but because you do have to be more careful with anonymous sources and where you're getting your information from, because it is a lot easier for these people to come after you and for the government to come after you. I mean, there have been reports of police showing up on people's doorsteps in the UK over social media posts. And unfortunately, we're not that far from that in the United States. I mean, we have had disinformation and misinformation panels created in the Department of Homeland Security, where they have been directly coordinating with social media companies to go after jokes, memes, information that they deemed to be false that ended up being true. And unfortunately, the first case related to this, Murphy v. Missouri, the Supreme Court found that they didn't have standing to sue, but now Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is bringing up a similar case, and it has at least been found by a lower court to have proper standing.
The other side of this, and this is a huge, vast interpretation, wild interpretation, is you're not allowed to incite a coup, to overthrow the government. In this modern day and age, perhaps there is an argument to be made that having a vast conspiracy of bot networks, of disinformation folks, people being paid off by, we now know that influencers, whether they're aware or not, were part of a scheme to basically spread disinformation to influence our elections. Now, that has not been brought forward by, as far as I know, by any lawyers or the government, but there might be some sort of internal justification to pressure these tech companies to enforce disinformation, the bots, and the foreign influence, which they don't always do, by the way. They might be in communication because they're in communication over threats, over national security issues, which, the tech companies should be doing that with the government, but sometimes it goes too far. I completely agree. There's information that's shut down that they shouldn't be shut down, and they shouldn't be taking the orders from the government. But these tech companies are also not publications. They are tech companies, and they have their own rules.
Well, they have their own rules, but the First Amendment applies to them just like any other. The First Amendment does not specify journalists or media company. It's again, because I think I said this yesterday, the other day. It's a limitation not on the. It's not even an affirmative right. It's a limitation on what the government can do to stop speech. So it's not. It doesn't depend on the status of the speaker. It's really for the benefit of the audience. You have a right to hear information. The government has no right to stop you from hearing this information. Is the I think most accurate rate.
But media companies do have a different set of responsibilities, legal responsibilities.
Well, we can say they have moral responsibilities.
And legal responsibilities.
Well, they have legal responsibilities against defamation and those kinds of things. But I would be very skeptical of even national security justifications, because can we trust our government on national security? When they redact everything, they redact it. They're referring to intelligence that only they can see, and they say this is a vital matter of national security, and there's all this influence. How do we even know that they're right? And time again, what we learned during their interactions with social media companies is they were making assertions that such and such accounts or were bots or were foreign-based. And those claims made by the federal government, in some cases they were true, but they were also in many cases false. And that is my word. And Twitter, again, at the time, not run by Elon Musk, not run by a right-wing conservative figure, run by...
Jack Dorsey's conservative.
Well, the moderators were... I don't know if Jack Dorsey's conservative. The moderators is that Yoel Roth figure, who is very much a liberal progressive, clashing with what the FBI was telling him, arguing back, saying, these are not bots. These are not Russian-based accounts. These are Americans expressing their political opinions. The government was wrong about that.
Well, they were making an assertion, and I think the government should be asking the tech companies to declare, to flag. If there are bots coming from bot farms overseas, they should say that. Whether or not they should take...
But in this case, it wasn't.
It wasn't, but I'm saying they made the assertion, but the tech companies should come forward, and like I said this from the beginning, if we had an algorithm, if we had tech companies that didn't skewer one side or have an agenda, Silicon Valley, whatever libertarian agenda it is, far-right agenda in some cases, very male agenda.
Libertarian agenda and the far-right agenda. Right,
and male agenda, that's not you. Get rid of the bots. Is it that hard? They know that they have bots, and I know why they don't want to get rid of the bots, because there is this illusion that there are so many users, and we know this has come forward so many times, that Twitter does not, the numbers that they're reporting in terms of users is much lower than it is once you eliminate the bots. And that's not a great look when you're a company who wants to keep bringing in the money. And by the way, Twitter's value went down drastically yesterday, like over 80%. Elon Musk is in trouble right now. So you do have to deal with these issues.
Yeah. All right, we'll have more Rising right after this. Stay tuned.